Hello, Booktube, and welcome back to Read Becca, or welcome if you're new here. Octofinals has finished, woohoo! So if you don't know what Booktube Prize is, I will link all the details down below so you can check it out, but it's just a very fun prize that's put together for the Booktube community, and we get, in the Octofinals, 8 groups of judges for 6 books in each of 3 categories this year, and that's fiction, nonfiction, and translated fiction. And I specifically wanted to go for translated fiction, so I was in translated fiction group F. And I only knew of one of the books prior to this. Now, we had long lists of books for voting on what should go into the prize, so I had to research all of the books, but there were so many books in that list that I didn't really remember most of them. I did do thorough research though. So I was going in intentionally fairly blind. I did not read any of the backs of these books or try to refresh my memory on them. But it was a really interesting experience. I don't think I would have picked up most of these books on my own. So that was, number one, very interesting experience going in and not really having these be my type of book usually. I do read a fair amount of translated fiction, just not this sort. So the other thing that was interesting is that I took a lot of notes going in through this process. And I'm not a huge note taker when I read, but I took extensive notes about these, and it was so entertaining to see how different the notes about each book were. So one of the books, I exclusively took notes about the plot, and that was it. I didn't really write anything else. And another book was only my reactions. So it was really jarring to see how different I was kind of processing each of these books. And I felt really overwhelmingly positive about the majority of the books. So we had 5 good books and 1 I really disliked. So let's get into the rankings from the bottom to the top. In last place, by a country mile, is An Apprenticeship or The Book of Pleasures by Clarice Lispector and translated by Stefan Tobler. I hated this book. I try not to be too negative about books, but this is a very slim book, and it lacks the characterization or plot or interest to even want to get through that short amount. It was a struggle to get through. So I couldn't really tell you very much about the plot. It's supposedly about a young woman who's not very sure of herself, and she gets into this relationship with an older man who's a professor who kind of teaches her to be a little bit more independent and self-aware. But that's very little of what's going on. It's a lot more about the two of them just coming together and having philosophical discussions, I would say. And it's one of those books that, for me, it is meant to sound really deep and introspective, but it's utter nonsense. And this was the only one of my books that is actually very stylistically written. So I didn't like the style that it was written in. Not that I have problems with very stylized writing. For instance, the first chapter lacks a lot of periods, intentionally, I think. The first sentence begins with a comma and goes on without any periods for a couple pages. Then later on, further into a couple chapters later, we have an entire section that's almost all sentence fragments, and everything begins with and or but. So very stylized, and it didn't feel like it was really there for a reason, to the point that I was actively distracted from the content of the book by the writing style. So I think overwhelmingly this was not the book for me. It just came across pretentious, and I really disliked it. So the good news is that the other 5 books I did actually like. So in 5th place I have 3 O'Clock in the Morning by Gianrico Carofiglio and translated by Howard Curtis. This one is a very, very simple story. It's another short one, and it starts with a boy who is going through something odd. He's experiencing something he doesn't understand, and that turns out to be epilepsy. So he is, at the very beginning of this, quickly going through the process of having a diagnosis and kind of treatment for that. And then the bulk of the book is moving on toward his late teens, when he and his father travel to Marseille to see a specialist that they've seen previously years ago, to find out if he in fact is over this epilepsy. because they said he may grow out of it. And so they show up there to see the specialist and find out, yes, he may in fact be over it. But unexpectedly, they're told they need to stay there for 72 hours and he needs to stay awake the entire time and then return back to get a confirmed diagnosis that he's over it. And so this is the 72 hours of them staying awake together in a city they're not really familiar with. And so they just kind of wander around and do random things. And that's not the point of it, though. It's that this forces them as two distant people to become more connected and open up to each other, have these very open, raw conversations. So that's really the heart of this book, is this moment in time between a father and son getting to know each other as they transition from a father and child to peers, really. So I liked this. I liked the writing style. It's very simple and plain. I think overall, most of my books were kind of window pane prose. They were not really anything fancy. But for me, this one was the weakest of the ones I enjoyed because I saw some character inconsistencies. There were times where the son was seeing his father in different ways that were completely opposed, and it did not imply that that was as a result of his getting to know his father more deeply over the course of this. It was that, he kind of perceived his father in totally different ways. As well, I just didn't connect with the characters. They're supposed to be having these really deep conversations, and I didn't feel any emotional connection to them, and that's going to come back up, I think. I also didn't like the end. The very ending felt kind of manipulative to me. So yeah, it was a mix. I enjoyed the reading experience. I think it was well worth reading, but it was not a new favorite. So in fourth place, I have The Passenger by Ulrich Alexander Boschwitz and translated by Philip Boehm. This one's an interesting book because it is a bit of a satirical novel, and it is from an author who was a Jew in Germany during the 1930s, and it's about a Jew in 1938 Germany experiencing the transition from kind of being antagonized and propaganda being negative about Jews to the outright destruction of Jewish property, people being dragged from their home, and that basically happening overnight. So he's dealing with this in a very jarring way. He has to flee his home, obviously, as part of this, and winds up on a train. And he's experiencing this with a lot of other Jews where, he at certain points is like, gosh, there are too many Jews on these trains. And it's laughable at moments, but also heartbreaking what they're going through. And so he is trying to deal with this as best he can while also just not understanding what's happening. He can't believe it at moments. So it's a really important book, I think, but didn't entirely work for me in the actual telling. It feels kind of clunky in the language at times. And in part, I think that's because satire doesn't always translate well. It's really hard to get across something subtle as satire when you're doing that. And so I don't know how much of that is the actual language that the book was written in, being originally from 1930s, or if that's actually the translations work, making it a little bit more clunky. But so the reading experience didn't flow as well for me. I think it's important. I think it's a great book, but not a new favorite. So getting into my final three. Any of these could have been my top book on a different day, really, but I've locked in this ranking, so we're gonna go with it. But they each had such high highs in terms of what was good about them, and then some detractor that kept them from being like a complete front runner. So I would recommend all of these. They were great. So the third place is My Heart by Semezdin Mehmedinović and translated by Celia Hawkesworth. So this one is following a man through kind of three experiences, I would say. So it is autofiction, and it sounds like these are actual experiences from his life. So I don't really feel like this belongs on a fiction list. This really, one of the interviews that I looked up, it sounds like this is exactly his experiences. So I don't understand why this is on a fiction list, but going with it. This one is so emotional. This was easily the best written of my books. It follows him as he is dealing with aging and having experience with a heart attack at the beginning, and kind of going through recovery and the painful process of that with his wife supporting him. And then he goes on a trip with his son where they get closer, and he sees his own treatment as an immigrant over the course of this road trip that they go on through the US. through the eyes of other immigrants in his experiences that he has run-ins with. So we're engaging with those topics. And then his wife also has a health issue, and he's grappling with it from the other side of being the caregiver. So it's really all about this perception of immigrant experience and the idea of aging in a culture where you don't really feel like you belong necessarily. And so I had so much emotion with this one and so much connection with the characters in this one that I think that was the real strength here for sure. In second place, I have There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job by Kikuko, Tsumura, and translated by Holly Barton. Now, this was my best reading experience. I just enjoyed reading this. I just wanted to pick it up, and it was so fun to read. It's very light, despite the content, it's really light. It's very slice of life. So this is a Japanese novel, and I get along with Japanese writing style very much. It's really minimalist, it's really slice of lifey, and we're following a character, I don't think we ever actually learn her name, who is going through having just burnt out at her previous job. She has quit and moved back in with her parents. And she is starting out at a recruiter's office with the demand that she's looking for a new job. And that job should be easy, it should be close to her home, and it should mainly require very little physical effort to the point she wants to be sitting most of the time. So literally, she is looking for an easy job. And we follow her as she goes through 5 different jobs. They're a little quirky and odd. Everything from sitting in a hut in the middle of the forest doing nothing to writing trivia for the back of cracker packets. And these are all very odd jobs. But it's just such a delight to watch her meet the characters that are at each job and come to understand each job. So there's not too much to the plot, really. Unfortunately, for me, I was so annoyed by the conclusion of this. The way that it wrapped up and the kind of messaging that it came out with was a complete turnoff. Initially, when I started thinking about my rankings, because of that alone, I had this in my 4th place spot because it was such a turnoff at the very end. But I just had so much fun reading this. This was a really great book to read, and I enjoyed the act of reading it, so I can't really fault it too much for that element at the end. So yeah, this one is a very conflicting one, and I have a hard time recommending it because of that ending, but it was such a great book. Finally, my top book was the heaviest in both content and weight, was The Republic of False Truths by Alaa Aswany and translated by S.R. Fellows. So this was really difficult to be reading in this particular moment in time because it is all about the Egyptian revolution and the protest/massacre at Tahrir Square. This is taking a look through the eyes of many characters. The character list for this is vast, of the sociocultural and political corruption of Egypt, and from top down, really. So there are characters everywhere from a general who is extremely powerful and has the ear of leaders, all the way down to these students who are involved in the revolution. So initially, it appears all of the characters are disconnected. We just keep getting introduced to more and more characters. And I had a major problem reading this at the beginning. I really disliked it because I was reading it and every character was horrible and unlikable and corrupt. This is really trying to hammer in the depth of corruption here. And it has a somewhat satirical tone. It's like that, just a little bit over the top, but everything is so awful. It opens with literal torture happening. So definite content warnings for very much of this. It's really dark content. But again, with that slightly satirical tone that, as I mentioned before with The Passenger, it's very hard to get across satire in translation. And I think this was effective at it because it is just a little over the top on the corruption. But eventually we do work through all of these horrible, unlikable characters, and we start to see people who are from the other side who are wanting to change and better Egypt. And then we start to see that those characters are interconnected with these awful characters and the way that the power dynamics work between them. So I think what this got across to me that I hadn't really thought about too much before was a lot of the minor things. So things like how the culture had built-in controls to be oppressive of people. Things like the way these girls are expected to live at home. Like, it's not culturally acceptable for them to leave home. And so even though these women had some agency and were able to become students and learn and be educated, they didn't have the ability to stand up and be independent and participate in the revolution as much as they would have liked, because they kind of had to bend to a family that's supporting them and housing them, and it just wouldn't be culturally acceptable for them to leave. And so it's really contributing at the minor level to the oppression that carries all the way to the top. And so this book got across that aspect so well, of this tapestry of oppression woven into culture at every level. And it being so grand and expansive, following all of these characters, was amazing how it got that across. So I think that aspect was really powerful. And even though it was a very difficult time to be reading that in the world right now, I think it had more impact in the end, getting to that point, and reading about something like that, where I can see echoes of that in my own culture, unfortunately. So this was my absolute top pick. I think this was probably the most important book to read that I would put in people's hands, because of those analogs to our own society in the Western world right now, where I am seeing a lot of that top-down corruption in elements of politics. So very difficult reading, very heavy, but well worth the time for sure. So that is my Booktube reading. Finally made it through the Octofinals. I'm taking the next round off, I think. So I'm really looking forward to seeing which, if any, of my picks made it through. If you're seeing this, that means they've already been announced. So I will link the semifinals announcement down below and we'll see together. But I think I made really good picks and my top 3 should make it through. So as always, thank you so much for watching.